According to Epiphanius of Salamis, Valentinus was born along the nourishing streams of the Nile Delta. While pursuing his higher education at Alexandria, he presumably would have rubbed shoulders with the likes of Vassilides and Carpocrates, possibly even Marcellina, Isidore, and Epiphanes. As a student, Valentinus drank most deeply from the wells of Platonic and Pythagorean lore. In terms of identity, however, Valentinus was a Christian and one of the very first Christian theologians in history. Perhaps already in Alexandria, Valentinus led a Christian enclave. We intuit this from the works he left behind. Valentinus preached sermons, published biblical interpretations, and wrote letters, fragments of which were later quoted by Clement of Alexandria. Just as Vassilides claimed a kind of apostolic succession from Peter through Glaucius and Matthias, Valentinus claimed to be in the line of Paul through a man called Theudas, who was perhaps the apostle better known as Thaddeus. Even if they were not apostles or apostolic, Glaucius and Theudas may have been two of the earliest known Christian teachers in Alexandria. In terms of career, Valentinus set his sights higher than Vassilides. Teaching in Alexandria, Vassilides secured enduring fame in Egypt. Yet those who sought greater influence set sail for Rome, the beating heart of empire. Artemidorus, the dream interpreter, observed that free men go, even against their will, to Italy, for just as heaven is the house of gods, so Italy is the house of kings. Valentinus was one of several dozen figures, including Marcellina, who debuted in the imperial capital. He stayed there for a maximum period of 30 years and a minimum period of 15. Valentinus arrived at Rome around the same time as another ambitious Christian teacher, Marcion. Unlike Marcion, however, Valentinus never separated from established ecclesial networks. Instead, Valentinus became so famous in one network that he was almost voted its leader. The only reason why he lost, according to Tertullian, was because his competitor was a confessor, that is, a person arrested for being a Christian. In his surviving writings, Valentinus does not show any sign of feeling ostracized or transgressive. And to our knowledge, he was never expelled from any church communion and never banished anyone himself. It seems, rather, that Valentinus devoted his energies to developing a church within a church, a small community of tightly knit, intellectually oriented Christians eager to represent their faith as the best of all philosophies. How to explore Valentinus's thought and religious practice is one of the thorniest questions in early Christian studies today. In large part, this was because Valentinus's thought was a kind of fullness that spilled over into many different streams. As in the case of Vassilides, it's safest to judge Valentinus not by later heresy reports, but by the testimonies and fragments recording the traces of his own voice. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and this channel depends entirely now on your support. So, if you'd like to see more content like this, please consider supporting me on Patreon or by a one-time donation. Links are in the description. There are two misconceptions about Valentinus that can be found broadly on the internet and even among scholars. The first is that Valentinus created the system or story about the proliferation of aeons. And the second is that Valentinus borrowed or adapted his teaching from the Sethians, aka the Gnostics of his time. Both theories, I think, can ultimately be traced back to Irenaeus. In Book 1, Chapter 11 of his Against Heresies, Irenaeus attributed a highly complex aonic system to Valentinus himself, claiming that he adapted the principles from a Gnostic heresy. In his actual report, however, Irenaeus only mentions one single similarity between Valentinus and the Gnostics, that the creator emerged along with a separate being called a left-handed ruler, aka the devil. This is hardly a convincing basis upon which to establish a genealogical connection between Valentinus and an amorphous crowd of Gnostics. Then, when Irenaeus sums up his reports in Book 1, he claims not that Valentinus, but that the heirs of Valentinus actually borrowed and adapted from the mob of Gnostics. In my view, this revised remark might possibly be more accurate. Although most scholars reject Irenaeus' claim that Valentinus taught the aonic system attributed to him by Irenaeus, for some reason most still cling to the idea that Valentinus himself borrowed or adapted principles from so-called Gnostics. I want to emphasize here that the jury is still very much out on this question. The first thing to note is that Valentinus is very early. He was born evidently around 100 of the Common Era and flourished in the 130s and 40s. I don't think we can assume that there was anything like a developed concrete Gnostic school at this time, or even a school of thought. The earliest Gnostic, aka Sethian text to emerge is the Gospel of Judas, which most scholars seem happy to date around the mid to late 2nd century, 155 to 170 or thereabouts. Conceivably, then, it was the author of the Gospel of Judas who could have adapted principles laid out by Valentinus, or, as I prefer to think, it's probably impossible from our very distant perch on the arrow of time to look 1900 years back to determine exactly who influenced who, given our lack of data. Instead, we should think about mutual patterns of influence and interaction. The interaction specifically of Christian creation stories in a philosophical key, being told in this period probably for advanced initiates in places like Rome and Alexandria. Now, Irenaeus cites several creation stories in his Against Heresies. We can focus on what can be called the Barbeloite creation story in Against Heresies 1, chapter 29, and the creation story attributed to Valentinus back in chapter 11. Both stories do involve aeons, or eternal beings representing the thoughts or attributes of the Father. But when did an actual story about aeons arise? That's an important historical question, since most of the groups described by Irenaeus, namely the followers of Simon, Carpocrates, Saturninus, and Marcion, they don't have a story of creation involving aeons. So who actually is the first person or group who came up with a story of aeons? I think that the evidence best points to one of Valentinus's disciples, namely Ptolemy. Irenaeus makes clear that when he initially presents a story of aeons in what has come to be known as the Grande Notice, he presents the views of Ptolemy, not of Valentinus himself. It was Ptolemy and the fellow students of Valentinus who actually systematized a story about aonic proliferation in a discrete pattern, moving from a single aeon or dyad, then to a tetrad, then to an ogdoad, with both a decad and a dodecad of aeons emerging from the ogdoad. I call this Ptolemaic system of aeons the 8-10-12 pattern. There are many variations on this pattern that developed after Ptolemy, but it's Ptolemy and his heirs who held up this distinctive number pattern first, probably based in part on Neo-Pythagorean speculations. I don't think this particular pattern goes back to Valentinus. I believe that it was invented by Ptolemy or perhaps another of Valentinus's students. It was, in fact, Irenaeus then who inferred that if the student Ptolemy taught a system of aeons, then Valentinus himself must have taught such a system. But this was and is an unhistorical inference. During his lifetime, Valentinus was never attacked as a heretic. Only his followers, called Valentinians, began to be attacked as heretics by the likes of Justin Martyr and Hegesippus. This was in the early 160s and 170s. And it's significant that Justin, who wrote or at least promoted a text called the Compilation Against All Existing Heresies, about 145, never included Valentinus and never spoke of an aonic system. Justin died around 165. It was Irenaeus, writing 15 to 20 years later, who added the aonic systems to his heresy catalog, both Valentinian and Gnostic. And it was Irenaeus who put a huge emphasis on these aonic systems because he considered them to be the weirdest and most unchristian teachings taught by his opponents, and therefore a way to ridicule them. In reality, teachings about aonic systems were probably reserved for advanced Valentinian and Sethian initiates who took the equivalent of advanced graduate seminars in Christian theology. It was Irenaeus who, collecting the writings of his enemies, published them to everyone, as if these teachings were the first things one would learn in the Valentinian church. It must be remembered, however, that the Valentinians with whom Irenaeus interacted were, it seems, the heirs of Ptolemy and others of Valentinus's circle. By the time Irenaeus was writing, Valentinus himself was almost surely dead and could have been dead for as much as 20 years. Even heresiologists later than Irenaeus could distinguish Valentinus from his student Ptolemy. Tertullian, for instance, said that it was Ptolemy who distinguished the aeons with names and numbers as personal substances outside of God. Whereas Valentinus, says Tertullian, conceived of aeons, but he conceived of them as eternal thoughts, sentiments, and movements in the supreme deity. They were never moved out of deity, moved out of the fullness. They were never seen as personal agents, and they never appeared in numerical patterns. Tertullian also asserts that it was Valentinian teaching that provided the seedbed for the growth of Gnostic teachings. So, in a sense, reversing the typical order proposed by scholars. This testimony can, I think, roughly be confirmed by Valentinus's authentic fragments, where he never mentions personified aeons. It's also confirmed by the Gospel of Truth. Now, we need not assume that the Gospel of Truth was written by Valentinus. At the same time, we can use the Gospel of Truth to get a sense for what might have passed for Valentinus' own teachings, since it appears to reflect an earlier stage of thought prior to the 8-10-12 pattern of emerging aeons. The Gospel of Truth says nothing about this particular pattern. It only indicates that the all or the entirety sought for the one from whom they came forth, and they were inside, they were never outside this one. And it wasn't wisdom who fell, but error and ignorance that grew strong and fashioned our material world. To sum up then, when did the story of aeons emerge? Probably, I think, in the 160s or 170s in the school of Ptolemy at Rome. This is probably the time when the Gospel of Judas appeared. This is the first text that, again, can probably be called Sethian. In this text, there are some aeons, but they don't form pairs, and there are no female aeons, at least in what survives, despite the fact that Barbello is mentioned. There is no fall of wisdom to produce the cosmos, and no single evil creator. Instead, we have two evil angels, Nebro and Saklos. So, what can we conclude from this data? If we really want to understand Valentinus, we can't assume that he taught the story about aeons preached by his students. These stories of aonic proliferations pairing off and appearing in numeric patterns are most likely later than Valentinus himself. It was Epiphanius who claimed that the elderly Valentinus sailed to Cyprus, where he was shipwrecked. One could take this statement literally, that Valentinus's vessel was lost. Probably, however, Epiphanius meant to say that Valentinus had shipwrecked his faith when he taught on the island, which later became Epiphanius's own home. Now, there's no evidence that Valentinus changed his teachings later in life, or that he ceased being a Christian. If Valentinus did teach on Cyprus, he may have died there of old age. The fragments of Valentinus reveal him to have been a gifted author, speaker, poet, and interpreter of Scripture. He was a visionary who claimed a special revelation of the Logos in the form of a baby. Yet he also reacted to secular literature, notably Plato. And with Plato, Valentinus believed in a creator who made the world according to a higher model, a living spiritual realm where an infinitely good God abides and who gave birth to his Logos or Son. This Son is called the pre-existent human who sent a seed of his higher reality into the first human being. The body of this human was made by hostile angels who were shocked when their formation stood up and talked back to them. From that time onward, the human essence has been deathless, and those who realize this point take their first step toward overcoming the sinful structures of this world. Valentinus acknowledged the dangers of this world. The angels hostile to humanity at creation are akin to demons who invade the human heart, stirring in it a whirlpool of wicked desires. Yet death is a problem only for those who do not realize that the seed of divinity in them cannot die. Death is expended in the bodily deaths of believers when they shed their garments of skin and rise as purified spirits to the living realm above. For Valentinus, the Logos of God became incarnate in Jesus, since otherwise he would not have come as a baby or have eaten food. Jesus served as a model of bodily control. In the surviving fragments, Valentinus did not mention Christ's cross, though he did declare that Christ endured or suffered all things. All this data is information we glean from the genuine fragments of Valentinus. If we want to know Valentinus's actual thought, we have to prioritize these genuine fragments. But these fragments are not easy to understand, and they need a lot of background knowledge. That's why I've designed a course on Valentinus that takes you line by line through his fragments in order to produce a composite picture of Valentinus and his thought. Please look for this course to appear in the coming weeks. The best way to get access to my courses is to join my Gnosis Academy, which will also give you access to 3 of my best-selling courses, namely Marcion of Pontus, Simon of Samaria, and Gnostic Literature Part 1. This subscription to the Gnosis Academy also comes with a monthly hangout with me online where you can ask any question you'd like. I welcome you. See the links in the description.